Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Cara Romero. Welcome to the 18th Annual Indigenous Forum. We're on day 2. Today, we're going to talk about the power of art in our communities. It's something that, in our Indigenous communities, we talk about all of us being born with, and art can come in its many, many forms through us, and maybe even from something greater than us is where our art comes from. And it's not something that only certain people have. Everybody has a right to make, to create, to be artists. And within these abilities that we have to be artists is healing. And if there's something that we need in our communities, and really with all peoples now, it's healing, right? And we see art disappearing from our schools, and art disappearing from all the places where we desperately need it. And I wanted to talk to Joy today about what art has given to me, to my community, and what her art inspires us to think about and to be about. And just for a moment, I'd like to just, by a show of hands, or if you feel compelled to stand up, who are the other Native artists in the room, or who are the artists in the room? Don't be shy. How about even if you just think you're an artist, but you're not sure, keep your hands up. All right. This one's for you, okay? So, Joy, would you like to open up with your reading? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mado, thank you, Greyhawk. And Kara. So this was part of a little book that was called Catching the Light. That was part of a, I was asked to do a speech and then write a book from the speech for this Yale University event, but I wrote the book first because that was harder. And I divided into 50 little sections, and this is one of them. These are just thoughts. The assignment was why I write. And I think, it's sort of like what you were talking about that there was something planted in you, the storyteller. Where does that come from? It's part of your spirit, but it's also your spirit coming through a familial genealogy, a place, plants. I mean, all of that really it all figures in. And I wondered, how did I become a poet? Or what is it? And there's the familial genealogy, and then there's your spiritual genealogy, the spirit of your soul's genealogy, the genealogy of a place, the genealogy even of ideas, genealogies of songs, and so on. Every place has guardians whose responsibility it is to tend that person or place. There are guardians of cities, mountains, plants, and animals, for all beings and states of mind on this planet Earth. These guardians are real, and in healthy societies, they are active. I was thinking, too, about guardians of color, different colors, because they also have a resonance and they also communicate, etc. When the guardians or keepers of these lands are forcibly removed, massacred, and their lifeways stolen through the theft and warehousing of children, when female power is no longer standing equal with male power, then the lands suffer. We all suffer. The waters become polluted, fires are out of control, storms become massive and aggressive, and the earth trembles. There is confusion and destruction among all those who inhabit the land these times. But we can change the story, and that is done by the artists, the thinkers, and the dreamers, those who can envision from within this immense field. Indigenous artists must be part of the leadership in the revision of the American story. We can change the story of a violent hierarchy that follows in the wake of the Popple Bulls, proclaiming indigenous peoples as non-humans for land and resource theft and slavery, to manifest destiny, which opened the West and the world for the taking and set in place a caste system that places value according to skin color, culture, sexual identity, and economic standing. We can turn to honoring female power, without whom there is no life. Rivers, mountains, lands, other animals, and elemental inhabitants will be respected co-inhabitants. Time, experience, and the ancestors have taught me that it is while practicing our arts and in ceremony that we come closest to who we really are as individuals, as part of a family, a generation, a country, a planet, a timeless point of experience. It is when we come into close contact with our ancestors, the origin. We must feed that place, honor it. I bow down to the story keepers, to the keepers of poetry. I'm reminded of the water spider who, when the earth was covered with water, carried an ember on her back so we could make fire to keep the story going. Everything is a prayer in the becoming as she approaches us, swimming through time.
Thank you. I want to ask you about your earliest memories, about your childhood, about those memories that form us, that make us who we are later in life. And I know the stories of the Muskogee Creek people and how they made it to Oklahoma. Can you talk a little bit about your family's history, about coming to Oklahoma, and maybe a little bit about what you were like as a young girl?
Oh, man. That's a long story. I
That's
know,
all right.
like, where do we start? Because we started out in the Southeast and were illegally removed by Andrew Jackson, who is, went against Congress, et cetera, to force us out. And, my relatives stood up at Battle of Horseshoe Bend against that illegal move. But, and here we are now in Oklahoma. Muskogee Creek Nation is now in Oklahoma. And, my father's Muskogee Creek, and, we knew the story, we knew our relatives' names, and I had, and that's just always part of you. It's not something that, I didn't come from a stereotype. Just like, I like what you were saying, Greyhawk, about that. I came up in a family. There was cool stuff. My mother, wrote songs and did demos for her music. And, my dad, he was so good looking. It was, and he loved to party. and we lived next door to the bootlegger. Yeah. So, we had some good times until they weren't any good times. Yeah. But I grew up in a house of music. I grew up in a house of, but also of really, now there's a word for historical trauma. There wasn't then, but, there were those kinds of things happening too. But in the middle of it all, I knew I was loved. And I always had a kind of compassion for my father and my mother. And I think in my earliest life, or even the earliest memories, is I have a new book coming out in October called Girl Warrior, which is called Girl Warrior, a coming-of-age handbook, especially for young Native women, because I meet a lot of you along the way, and I think about you. So one of my first memories, of course, is being a kid. And you realize, you think about your consciousness now, but when you're a little child, your consciousness was still there. And as a child, I can remember being in that realm where it's like the realm you go to when you create. Or if you're really good at fixing cars, and you're listening to the engine and all that. It's the same kind of realm. Or scientific study, or with a baby in your arms at 3 a.m. while you're trying to rock them to sleep. It's a similar kind of realm where you're in touch with things. And I remember very early on that I preferred to be there sometimes or outside. I wanted to be by myself. Often I felt more myself by myself. I was in the closet a lot. So, The closet was full of my art, as was the garage. But I wasn't really, we were laughing the other day about names and naming, and I said, well, I was so morose, but they named me Joy. I mean, I was funny. I mean, I was good at, I cared about my mother so deeply. I would run her bath, and I would do things to make her laugh. I was always doing things to make people laugh, but I'd get into trouble. I got into more trouble than any of my brothers and sisters, just because I would I was very creative. But but I loved, the art is where I found myself. And we were talking about this earlier. We don't really have words for art. I think it's part of something everybody did. You'd sit at the table, people would be drawing, carving, it was all knitting, whatever people did. It's just all part of life, the art of life and the art of living.
I think my very earliest memories are when our family relocated from Los Angeles. I was born in Redondo Beach in Los Angeles to interracial parents. My dad is Native, my mom is non-Native. And our tribe had reorganized in the heart of the Mojave Desert, and my whole family moved back. My grandparents, my aunts and uncles, my mom and dad, my brother and I, and we all lived in one trailer at the end of a dirt road, which eventually became our first council house for our tribe. And we had the most pristine, undeveloped shoreline on the California side of Lake Havasu. And it was just in its kind of new, strange beginnings at an edge of, all of our ancestral homelands were under the water. And here we were moving back as a tribe after a time of great sadness. Everybody had left when they flooded in the valley, and we moved back. But every day was like maybe 40 or 50 years back in time, and we rode around in the back of pickup trucks, and we
did that too. It's illegal now.
It's illegal. We fished. Time was different. We played along the shoreline, and we had wild animals everywhere. I remember we had a lot of wild donkeys in the desert of California, which is such a strange thing but a lot of wild donkeys would just come up and visit with us on the shoreline. And I never, as I became an artist, I know a lot of you guys know me as the director at Bioneers, but I'm also an artist. And so it's both. I'm both. And I never thought of myself as an artist. It wasn't something that we pursued it wasn't a pursuit. But I think back as we get asked these questions a lot, and when did you know you were an artist, or when did you become an artist? And I have to think back to these early memories and think, well, I was always an artist. That was my best friend. When there was chaos, when there was drinking, when there was trauma, when you got sent to your room for getting in trouble, art was always there, never asking anything from me. It was always just a place that I could go. And so I drew for hours. That's, I grew up before cell phones and computers and all of that. And I think of those early childhood memories so fondly. And I think that they're really important to who we become and how we form as young individuals. And I'm curious to know when you knew you were an artist.
I always was, but as you were talking, I was thinking about soundscapes and childhood soundscapes and how they've changed, maybe. As you were talking, because I was thinking, well, I love music. I've always loved music. And, the radio, that's how we got our music. And it wasn't until, I don't know, I was about 12 that we got a stereo, which was a big deal. But because there were records, and I think as a teenager, then I had a little record player. But it was the soundscape was very, very different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that, hearing you and working on your biography to introduce you earlier, your quote about putting a pen in your hand and that's how you got through it. I think that moved me so much because I think a lot of times we grow up out of place, that here we are like young Native kids in public school systems and, we live in these like parallel worlds where it's, one way back home and then representation in academia or media or Hollywood is like absurdly different, or what we read in textbooks about ourselves or when we study cultural anthropology. And when I stumbled back into art, for me, it was photography that changed my life. But I knew instantly that I was going to be able to tell stories through the art, that I wasn't going to fit in writing textbooks or maybe being a Native studies professor, but it was actually through art. And can you talk a little bit about the power that you felt when you became an artist to maybe do more for your community and for people than you ever imagined?
Well, I always was I felt like an artist, but I thought I was going to be a painter. And I was in 2 art shows in 6th grade. I had a piece that was traveling, and then Philbrook Art Center used to have a yearly art show of student art, and I had a piece in that. So that's what I always thought I was going to be. And because I could go into that space and listen and create and so on. And I was at the University of New Mexico and part of Kiva Club, which was, it was our Native student center and place where we could go and be ourselves and be with each other. And we were, because of the times, I think it was started as kind of a social club, but it became, a place of awareness and issues, political gatherings, and so on. We became very active, and a lot of political action, Native rights movements were going on, and so on, and a lot of the surrounding Native communities, some of them would come to us because, well, we're Native students at the university, so we must be smart in those kinds of ways, because that's why a lot of us were sent there or were there, so we could go back to our communities with what we learned out there. And I remember going out to some of these meetings with uranium companies out near Laguna, or out in Navajo land where, we're dealing with coal companies, and just sitting there and witnessing. I was a witness, and listening to. That's where, for me, my mother's song lyrics, poetry, and music, but listening to how this beautiful ways these people talk. Sometimes it's in their own language, sometimes in English, that was very metaphorical, in the way that I think all of us used to use language. I've heard language people in Muskogee, Hawaiian, and other Native languages say people don't speak in metaphor like they used to. Because in your text, you usually don't speak in metaphor. Well, what does metaphor do? It opens you up to, it opens the space up from maybe 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional to maybe 5 or 6-dimensional. That's the power of metaphor. So I was listening to these people in the community make this connection with who they were as a people and how they belonged to the land, and how they had been there, and what the land, why they were there, and what their connection was. And they were standing there as guardians. And I was that's really what got my writing started. I started writing poetry. Of course, my early poetry is gangly, and it needed a lot of work. But that's what, I came to realize that what motivated me was healing and justice. Those became major motivators. But poetry, to me, was similar to art, in the sense that you're still, even in art, you're dealing with rhythm, you're dealing with color, you're dealing with phrasing, it's just, in images in a certain way. I used to tell the artist John Quick to see Smith, I said, you paint like a writer, and I write like a painter. You know?
I love that.
And that's what started my poetry, really, was that. And it wasn't until there I was going to UNM with University of New Mexico with 2 little kids, doing work study, living on nothing. Carmen Foghorn and I were talking about this earlier, about how did we get by. You know, going to school with 2 kids, work study, not enough money to go around, and yet this thing took over. I mean, I didn't plan it. I remember going into my art, the professor who had been mentoring me in drawing and painting, and I also did some photography, and telling him I was going to leave to do creative writing, which made no sense to anybody. How are you going to make a living? Poetry? And then nobody wanted to give you money for scholarships, because poetry is not useful. You know, we need doctors, we need educators. But there was something, and what is that? There was something that was planted in me that I had to take care of. And when I veered from it, and there was a time when I said, I'm tired of this, I want to have fun, all kinds of bad, when you go off your path, you know it. I didn't go off it long, but when you go off your path, there's all kinds of stories in our cultures about what happens. Pinocchio is one of them. It's an Italian story about what happens when you go off your path. But it came clear to me that, and it didn't make logical sense. A mother with 2 children, how are you going to make a living? But it was something I knew beyond knowing, and it gave me to create and then to work with that, because a lot of people think, okay, poet, you just get inspiration, you write it down, and there you are. It is so easy. There's a lot of revisions. I mean, like sometimes 50, 100 something sit for everyone. Every creation is different. And I grew to respect that, but it's demanding. It demands, when other people are out having a good, there you are. It's very demanding, and nothing is given to you for free. But it's brought more. It was not about me at all. I realized it was not about me at all. It was about what needed to come through on behalf of healing, on behalf of justice.
I think art is such a spiritual path, such a spiritual endeavor. And I appreciate you saying, about your early work that, it wasn't so hot.
No, it wasn't.
And I think I can relate to that, but I think that that's really important for young people. I had my very first art teachers were basket makers, and they were bead workers back home. And Shuggie Fisher once told me it takes 6 seasons to become a basket weaver, 6 years to even be able to finish one, to understand, all the complexities of the gathering, of the art making. And we used to sit and talk about how maybe that applies to other art. And when I talk to other artists, they're like, well, maybe it takes 10,000 hours to hone your craft. And really, you just keep getting better. And they never tell you that when you're young. Here we are, every decade that passes, I think I look past at the last decade and I'm like, oh, that wasn't as good as what I can make now, So it's like this spiritual path that, just continues to give back and continues to give back, and you get better and you hone your skills. And they dismiss it like science or engineering, but truly art is something that can be practiced. And in that practice, you can become better. And what you're becoming better at is, connecting with people. You're becoming a communicator through visual mechanisms or through audio or all these different things. And I don't want to go too far if you have something to say, but.
No, it doesn't end. We're always learning. I mean, it doesn't end. So I got to go hear Bob Dylan open up his next tour. He's 83, I think. He's going to do 54 cities through September. Yeah. And so I heard he opened up his tour in Tulsa. And he's not known for his voice. But that's what stood out. It's interesting. It taught me, is that here he is, 83 years old. His voice, I could tell that he had been working with phrasing. his voice was better than I'd ever heard it. 83, and I could tell that he keeps, he keeps practicing he keeps learning. I mean, that's an artist. That's an artist. You keep learning and you keep being challenged. That's the thing. If you're not afraid, I've gone through that with music too, as I started playing music when I was almost 40. And it's just, it's an ongoing process, and sometimes you're in places that are terrifying because you're going to make a certain leap. But then you pull together, you got to learn other kinds of craft to incorporate into what you're doing, or, it's just the whole process. It's actually your life. I mean, our lives are like that, a creative process. Some of us are a little too much creative in our lives, but that's, it's all together. It's not something. I think it came out of Europe, where you had people who were special. I mean, everybody's got specialists, people who are good at things, where you have an audience instead of participants. I mean, there's a difference in terms of, a participatory part versus people who are, there's a hierarchy. I guess that's the thing, an institution of a hierarchy.
Yeah. I think it's also dangerous when we stop practicing. That's something that I've experienced in my life. And as you get older, I'm at the great in-between at almost 50 now. And I can look back and talk to my younger self and remember that the darkest times in my life were when I wasn't creating. And the lessons that gave me, that there's some kind of self-sabotage, that maybe we as Native people coming through trauma think, I don't deserve to have that happiness, or I don't deserve to take care of myself. And I think with art making, it can feel very, from the outside, frivolous, or like you have this need to be selfish with time, but it's actually, for all of us, this radical act of self-care to give yourself time to create, and I think when we become mothers, it's in our nature to sacrifice everything, right? And to, I think I learned that when I was making milk, that my body would steal its own bone marrow to nourish my children, that this child was the most important thing. But that metaphor for me was like, you may also sacrifice your art making, or, the things that keep you spiritually whole. And we have to problem solve as mothers, as art makers, like how can we look at this importance of spiritual health and creating, especially as women, to carve out that time for ourselves and to give us that it's not selfish, it's self-care, and it actually makes your children healthier and you're going.
Yeah, but there's so much judgment for women who pursue an art.
Yeah.
You have to walk through that. I remember I was so proud that I got an NEA grant, and I had just graduated from University of Iowa, so I would be home working, and people would say, well, because you're not doing anything, da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Yep.
Or even taking that time, there's been a judgment, well, you took that time away from your children. Or, there's a lot of that. A lot of it's unspoken, but but it's there. I was laughing. I've wound up in some things I would never have believed. But I remember going home after I played a set it was a Jesse Ed Davis tribute concert we had in the Performing Arts Center, and I did a set and got to be there with Jackson Browne and sing with Taj Mahal and all things I would never believe. Here I am at this age, and I'm up there, jumping around. And anyway, I get home, I told my husband, I said, I bet none of those guys are at home folding laundry.
Yeah. That's when I get my best ideas.
Or cooking or doing any of that, but then I've dealt with that my whole life, is watching how I think women, we tend to, and I'm not saying that men don't have their thing too, but men are given free, they don't even have to think about asking permission. And women, we have to, fight for our time and even place sometimes in the whole in terms of being an artist, because there's so much on, with our children. I love how you were talking about nursing and how you would do anything. It's built in. But, our art's also like that. It's out of the same place of creating and giving birth and taking care of children. Art is it's the same thing in a way, because you're giving birth to something that comes through you, and you give birth to it, and you nurture it, and you grow it. It's similar. It's very similar to have children. And there's also, you were talking about self-care, and then I think also about culture care, which is similar. Like when you're doing your art, it's not just about you, and yet there's so many stereotypes, of course, of natives and native art. But there's where was I going for that? I was hoping that wouldn't happen. It'll come back to me. But yeah, there's so many stereotypes that we deal with, with all of it. But it's such a profound, to be in that space and to be able to do that. Mothering, giving birth is utterly profound beyond speaking. But it's similar too as being an artist, and and what's something coming through you, and it's profound, and that's how we know who we are as people, is our artists. And yet it's so difficult to get funding for arts and artists and native arts and artists. When I was a founding board member of Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, and eventually was the chair, but I stepped off after I was there almost all the years. I stepped off once because I had to as a board member. But I remember we thought, okay, early on we have to raise money. Well, we'll go to tribal nations and raise money. Yeah, think again. No one wanted to give money for art. Oh, what does that do for us? How does that help? We're just trying to get by. And artists, they're just selfish. It's just selfish act. And yet, I want to say, what are you wearing? Where's this building? I mean, all of it is just so interconnected with even the way we think, or the arts and all of the arts, and who we are. I mean, how do we know our history? How do we know who we are? What makes us? It's all about the arts and creativity.
I appreciate that work that you've done with Native Arts and Culture Foundation. And I think one of the things that we have to do as artists is we have to figure out how. And art is like this never-ending renewable resource, right? Like your creativity is never-ending. It will always regenerate, and it comes from something more than human. It comes from an incredibly special place. So, there have been times at a mom where I'm like, I just can't do this, but you have to figure out how. You have to drink coffee at night. You have to turn off the TV. You have to get a babysitter on the weekends. And, for me, I didn't know what I was doing at the time other than being selfish, or that's what it seemed like. But I was able to make art, and that kept my spirit happy. And in 2017, I got one of the grants from Native Arts and Culture Foundation. That was how we met. I was so excited. They said we got to go to Minneapolis and that I was going to get to meet Joy Harjo. She's in that room over there. And I was just like, big fangirl. I wanted to tell you in 7th grade, I played the saxophone for and that I knew she had gone to the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I had studied in Oklahoma. I was so excited to meet Joy Harjo, but they gave me $25,000 to make art for a year, and I made more art than I had ever made in my life, and I made good art. Yes, and it put me on the map, and you guys did more than that. You connected me with museums, and it was never a time in my life before I got that grant where they said, you're good enough, just go make it. Whatever your imagination can think of. And when you free artists to feel that they're not frivolous or spending their electric bill money on, creating dioramas or installations or things from their imagination, magic happens, right? And, once it's made, our society loves it and centers, these arts so much. But, there's a lot of us out there struggling, problem solving. And some of us, like my husband in particular, we can't be anything else, and we're often like the black sheep of the family,
Yeah,
right?
My brother and I decided we were the black sheep of the family. Yeah.
And I just say push through, like you have to continue pushing through and being the artist, and that it will come.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the Institute of American Indian Arts.
Oh, that place saved my life. But I wanted to make a little note here as you were talking. I was thinking about, why do you think the current administration is now going after the Smithsonian as shutting down the arts?
Yeah.
And because it is powerful, shutting down education.
Yeah.
Shutting down, any opening of our minds and creating culture.
I think it's especially scary for me because I've always looked, especially at Native arts, as the things that carry educational bundles that exist against all odds.
Right.
We were allowed to gather our shells. We were allowed to make our dance regalia. And we hid things. We hid knowledge.
Yeah.
We hid traditional teachings in our art. And I think a lot of times when you go to see Native arts now, all of that power is still hidden. And it's so important because art is disarming, and everybody can bring their own experience to art. And it doesn't ask anything of you, but if you can find a space for people, no matter their background, to think about things that they've never thought about, or to have empathy for Native peoples, or Afro-Indigenous artists, or Asian diaspora artists, or Latin artists. That is the power of art for social change. And so, we're going to have to just move around this administration. That is the other beautiful thing about art, is that it asks nothing of us. We don't need those institutions to share and to, embrace and to celebrate. And I think, the artists always during these times rise up.
That's true.
Yeah.
We found our way through it before.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you asked me about the Institute of American Indian Arts.
Yeah.
When I went there, it was the late 60s. I think it started in about 64, and I was there 67. But it literally saved my life. I mean, I went from a house of music to a stepfather who essentially banned music. When it was his time to come in, my mother would stop singing, and she didn't sing like she used to. And I accidentally forgot what time I was singing, and he came in and said, "There's no singing in this house." And so I tried to find a way out, and suicide was a possibility. And I thought, I want to go to Indian school. I didn't know about IAI then. So my mother took me over because I wouldn't have lived if I had stayed there. And we went over to the agency, the BIA, over in, I think we went to Muskogee. And she signed me up for Chilocco. I would have met my husband then, too. He was in Chilocco. Yeah, he went to Chilocco. And but as we were going out the door, my mother said, "Oh, and she's a really good artist." And the agent said, "Well, wait a minute. There's a new school here out in Santa Fe, Institute of American Indian Arts." And gave me the brochure, and so I applied, and I got in based on my art. And that, I was thrilled, and went out there, and that changed everything. I mean, you can imagine, I'd always thought of myself as an artist, and there I was it was 8th grade to 12th grade and 2 years postgraduate. And young Native people, all, and that's what I thrived. Before, I would not talk in class, and except note passing. And, I wouldn't, I stayed, I didn't engage much except with, the friends I had. but I was not in the Institute. That changed everything because I felt I was there in a place I belonged. With all these young Native artists, then we had teachers like Fritz Schulder, Alan Hauser, I mean, all these incredible Native artists, and it saved my life. Just to be around that and be inspired. And you know, even though we were kids, we would sit and talk together about what art meant and our art and how it related, even talking about sovereignty before there was a word sovereignty that was used, you know, and as it is now. And, you know, we kind of knew that and talked about how there was something coming through us of that generation, that we knew that it was part of our, not just our survival, but thriving as Native people. And that generation was, I think, coming through at that time really changed things.
It gave me the opportunity 30 years later to go to the same school. And I guess you're bringing up for me this idea of courage. And there's a moment as artists where we find our voice. And sometimes it's like, you know, we'll talk about finding our voice or finding maturity. For me, there was a few things that I felt a moment of liberation from the pressure of what people thought, liberation from expectations of the art world, you know. My grandmother, and there were elders in my life that inspired me, that gave me courage, and there were three of them that come up for me right away. My grandmother, when I would have moments of self-doubt, she said, "Oh, Cara, you need to stop worrying so much about what other people think." And it was just a moment where she was such a strong woman, and I never forgot that. There was another moment where we were relearning our dances as I was much older. I was in my 30s, and this is something that we go through as Native people. Things were taken away, and there's a certain humiliation that comes with relearning things at an older age when you're not a little kid. And my friend Willetta Wilder taught me. She was from Wallapai, and she said that as an older woman, she first started going to the dances, and the younger girls were teasing her. And she said, "Never be afraid to dance. It's between you and Creator." And that for me carried over into all of the art making, that, we often talk that it comes from a place bigger than self, but never worry about what other people think. And, you don't have to worry about stereotypes or whether your art fits in or what the world expects from you or where it's going to go. Do it because you're in communication with something much bigger than this world and yourself. Last question. What gives you courage to be who you are and what you've given to the world? Are there people? Is there something that drives you?
Well, I know what happens when I don't.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
When you should, I remember I felt great shame once when I was I was having such a good time hanging out in Penticton, BC. I helped them. I was on a committee, and we helped them start their writing and arts school up there at Penticton with the Native people up there. And I love that. Our first day we opened by picking blueberries and talked about blueberries and that whole process and so on. But we were at some big auditorium and the writer was hanging out with all these Canadian Native writers, and we were all together in Vancouver for some big thing, and everybody was they were saying, "Oh, so-and-so, come up and talk," and just everybody was getting up to talk, and they said, and then they called me up, and I wouldn't do it. I was so I just couldn't do. I was terrified. I wouldn't do it. What I felt was terrible after that, and I realized, well, it would have been better if I'd just gone up there and tried.
Yeah.
And so that's part of it, and I it's important to And I've had a lot of teachers with that. You know, I've had a lot of teachers in terms of facing fears and stepping through. So I've had a lot of mentors. I'm not here by myself necessarily, but in the end, it does come down. I like what you were saying about the Creator and yourself. That relationship is prime, and that's what art is that relationship, and what comes out of that relationship, the shape of your life, what you're doing. It doesn't, whether you're an artist or not, comes down to that relationship. You know, there's that presence always there, and that's, you know, as a little kid, I remember feeling that it's like when we all have that child in us. That's important to think of when you think of younger people and little children, that their consciousness, it's all there. They see what's going on. They may not be at a certain point of intellectual, comprehension or language comprehension, but their soul sees and knows, and that's who we remain. That's who we are, and all of that is within us. Even our elder selves, even as we're a little kid, because there is no time. Time works differently in that space. We're who we are. Even at whatever age. But I've had all kinds of teachers. I've had poetry teachers. My first poetry teacher at University of New Mexico, David Johnson. I've had art teachers. I was lucky that when I went to IAIA, my first music teacher was Louis Ballard, Quapaw Cherokee composer. Way ahead of his time, composing classical music with native themes, motifs, and elements. Nobody was doing that. Well, he was assigned as my advisor, high school advisor, So he was there. He got real excited when I started doing music. And I know he's still there. I've been around a lot of healers, and even got to work on horses when I was out in Hawaii and Waimanalo. A lot of horse ranch there, and helped out. We helped him get 501c3. I mean, it's all kinds of teachers, including my Aunt Lois and Harjo, who was like your grandmother to me. And she was a painter, and I got a lot from her, and I really miss her every day. And just, it's like that, friends. I've been very blessed with friends and mentors, a lot of mentors.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for taking those risks and being brave for all of us to see what's possible. You have affected a lot of young Native women, and that's a really special legacy to leave, and we honor you for being here. You're writing, you are in the studio, you are stepping out of being U.S. Poet Laureate, you are busy. And I just wanted to invite everybody to Joy's book signing. She's got a book, Girl Warrior, coming out. You got a rewrite of Girl Becoming.
I have an album coming out from Folkways. It'll come out early in 2026. With Esperanza Spalding. And let's see. I've got a musical. I'm looking for a place. I've got some interest in it, but it will show that Muskogee people were part of the origin story of jazz. That doesn't mean that it's not overtaking the African beginning. That nothing. They always talk about the European influence, but they always leave out Native influence too. And yet, Congo Square was a Homa village, and so there you go. Natives come in, see natives. Oh, let's eat together. We do music, and you can kind of see the cross currents there. So it's a story, but it's a young band who wind up going back to Congo Square from Oklahoma because the main character. Well, they're all main characters. That's the thing. It's kind of an ensemble cast, but one of the young musicians' father was Homa, and they go back to the wake and what happens. So,
can we get a big round of applause for Joy Harjo and Gray Hawk Perkins?
Yeah, and Greyhawk. And Cara Romero.